Okay, hi, welcome to the week 5 lecture videos for SOCA1010, and this week we'll be looking at consumption and lifestyles. So before I get into the different sections, where I'll be overviewing the terms and concepts that are important for this week's material, I'll be doing two video sections on different theories of consumption, and then finalising with a short talk about the politics of consumption. I've got a bunch of links that I'll be using throughout the videos that you can access from the lecture notes here. So sometimes I'll be stopping and getting you to kind of look at those videos and then continuing the lecture. Others are there for if you're interested in looking at some extras material beyond the lecture recordings. So I'll make that distinction as I'm going throughout the recordings today. So in terms of part 1, consumption overview of terms, I'd like you to start by clicking on that link from the lecture notes and looking at the really awesome video, The Story of Stuff. Animated video that I think brilliantly captures the connections between production and consumption. That's going to touch upon many of the things I'm talking about today, relating back to some of the things I was talking about last week on class. Some of the kind of references in it in terms of consumption, to iPods and stuff like that are a little bit dated, but the overall analysis I think still really works. So to start today's material, please have a look at that video. Okay, so if you've finished watching The Story of Stuff, you'll see here that the ideas of production and consumption are really intertwined. But where last week we largely focused on, in terms of class relations, on the production side of things, this week we're going to move towards the consumption side of things. So where Marx was largely interested in the relationships that people have to the production, the mode of production, Weber and Bourdieu and those that follow started to bring in these kind of other aspects of social relations that were around status and culture and the symbolic. And so the consumption culture is a particularly interesting way of looking at some of those aspects. So in terms of some key terms that are important for considering consumer culture, firstly, there's the idea of materialism. So in sociological terms, this is basically about how economic relations are kind of the cause of social phenomena, very much like Marx's base superstructure model that I went into some detail last week. But in more colloquial terms, it's kind of, in considering consumer cultures, concerns to the ways that people live in terms of their lifestyle. The idea that life becomes about accumulating personal wealth and goods, largely at the expense of everything else. There's all kinds of, aphorisms about this, stuff about like, he who dies with the most toys wins, which is a very famous Kerry Packer quote. The idea that to have a successful life, a satisfying life, you have to accumulate the most stuff. You'll see that I'm going to kind of come with a lot of conceptual and theoretical perspectives today that kind of criticise that point of view. So what we're looking at today is what's called consumerism. As I mentioned, Marx talked about production, and those kind of exploitative, alienating relationships would lead to some kind of revolution. Marxist theorists, after Marx, have started to wonder why that hasn't happened, why that revolution hasn't happened, even though, work is really alienating and exploiting, inequality's got worse and worse. And the analysis here starts to move towards consumer culture. These theorists, particularly throughout the 20th century, started to make arguments how the products that we buy manipulate us, promotes false consciousness, and our kind of immersion in consumer culture replaces class or class relations or class consciousness. In some ways, we become more loyal to brands and things than to particular political sensibilities. For some sociologists, this leads to the idea of the commodified self. And this is the idea that you would have heard, in films like Fight Club and other kind of popular cultural critiques, that people can't become what they consume. One's self-identity is shaped and understood through consumer and consumption practices. Another term for considering consumer culture is hedonism. This is a kind of a devotion to a way of life that's about happiness and short-term gratification. And in terms of consumer culture social analysis, this is largely done through what's called commodity fetishism. So what's commodity fetishism? This occurs where a person has a harmful obsession with collecting consumer goods, where objects can enslave those those who possess them. For the kind of critical theory that I'm going to kind of outline in the first couple of in the second lecture, consumer products become a way of sedating us. They provide us with false needs, and they lead us to try to not think, tend to not think very critically around about the world. That we then therefore do not invest ourselves in changing things for the better, and largely kind of just invest in the status quo. So, in terms of that relation between production and consumption, as I've mentioned already, Marx wasn't necessarily interested in consumption itself, but was interested in commodities, how they're produced, and particularly in the capitalist mode of production. Marx understood that in a previous era, people had some semblance of creativity and freedom and autonomy expressed in their work. The idea that, as I kind of mentioned, if you were, making tables, you would start with a tree and make it smaller and make it into bits and put it all together yourself from start to finish. If, as we moved into capitalist systems, you just became a cog in the machine, plugging, a leg on a table or whatever as in that system and how it works. This would lead to alienation and estrangement. So commodities played a role in Marx's analysis, but he was more interested in the processes of production. In terms of what we're looking at today, and in the second and third parts of the lecture, the different sociological ideas that I'll be talking about that critically analyse consumer culture. What we're more interested in today is how consumer culture puts forward a particular, what Marx has called ideology. The idea that it promotes a particular way of living, a particular way of thinking, and a particular way of being in the world. And this largely kind of hides the exploitation and alienation that we kind of experience at work and in other facets of life. So what's interesting here is that there's a kind of interesting juxtaposition going on in this analysis, is that in some ways capitalism is providing, particularly the middle classes, all the consumer goods, the toys and stuff we all want to play with, iPods and increasingly things like Facebook and all these kind of different things that take up our time. So in some respects, you would argue that if people are using these things by choice, that they're relatively happy, and therefore capitalism is providing what we all want. The critical theorists say that these isn't actually what we want. These kind of wants are kind of twisted into needs in capitalist society, and this is done through the media, through politics, and increasingly online as well. So a really good way of illustrating this, I think, is the snippet of analysis in this link here, which has the cultural critic as Zizek using the cult film They Live, to illustrate how ideology works. In that snippet, you'll see the main character, which is a famous kind of 1980s wrestler, Rowdy Roddy Piper, discovers a pair of glasses that allows him to see, the facade behind ideology. And then they use this kind of ridiculous kind of fight to symbolise how difficult it is to break that kind of ideology and to represent class struggle. So to finish this section, please have a look at that video.